Wow. And amen. Kim, Carol, choir, thank you so much for a wonderful rendition of one of my favorite hymns. First Christian Church, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. And Pastor Catherine, thank you for the invitation to come and be part of worship, to share a word, to be here as part of the 47 congregations that make up the Central Rocky Mountain region of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We stretch from Idaho to New Mexico. We have churches that are both east and west of the Continental Divide, churches in cities, churches in towns, large churches, small churches, strong churches, struggling churches, many different congregations. And yet we're called to be one church because we proclaim one gospel, we serve one Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So it is a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with you as part of that church, witnessing to the gospel here. Let me tell you a little bit about my ministry career. I'm actually second career in ministry. I started out in information systems. But my first call out of seminary was to a new church start in Cherry Log, Georgia. And so I was involved in new churches kind of from the beginning. When I moved from Cherry Log to serve a congregation in Fayetteville, Georgia, kind of on the south side of Atlanta, I got active with the Georgia region's New Church Commission. And so I continued kind of this pattern, working with new churches. From there, I was called to the Indiana regional staff as the director of church multiplication. More work with new churches and new church pastors, coaching these core groups and these pastors. And when I was talking with them, it seemed like I would say a lot, be very clear about who it is that God is calling you to serve. Be clear about how you are gifted to serve, because after all, you can't be all things to all people. I started working with congregations who were in some kind of transition, congregations that were in transformation, churches that were trying to discern God's call for them and find the compass that would point them into God's future for their church. And so I would talk to them about identifying where their gifts really were and finding out where that intersects with God's call, because after all, you can't be all things to all people. So I've always been just a little confounded when I get to this point and I hear Paul saying to Christians in Corinth and to Christians in Colorado Springs, I have become all things to all people so that I might by all means be able to win some. Is Paul trying to say that we need to be sort of chameleon churches? Churches that just sort of shift and change and blend into the background of whatever it is they happen to be sitting on at that time or in that space. And then I recall the words of my Greek instructor, who at some point in just about every class would say, without context, nothing makes sense. In this 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians, we're catching Paul sort of mid-sermon or mid-diatribe, if you will. Something that begins at the beginning of chapter 8 and runs almost to the end of chapter 10. And I really regard Paul as the first regional minister. He spent most of his time on the road. He dealt with a variety of different churches. I mean, if all the churches, early churches were the same, we wouldn't have needed multiple letters. One would have sufficed. And he often had to communicate with these churches by mail, and in dealing with them by mail was often dealing with some problem that was in the church. And in this particular letter to this particular church, Paul is trying to deal with or address a series of questions that the church has asked. So if you go back to the beginning of chapter 8, you see Paul introduce this section by saying, "Now concerning food that has been sacrificed to idols, And that was a hot button issue for this church in this time. We had temples to gods, to various idols. And part of that would be there would be a sacrifice made, an offering made, and then that meat would be prepared and served up in a banquet. And so if you got invited to one of these banquets, to one of these dinners, well, can you, as a Christian, go and partake in that? Can you actually eat food that's been sacrificed to an idol? It was a big question for them, and I'm sure the church thought in asking the question that it had a very simple answer. Yes or no. But Paul wants this church to see something beyond there. He wants to point out to them that it's really not about the food. It's really similar to, in the Cherry Log Church, Debbie and I had a couple of very close friends, Al and Terry. And when we made the move from Cherry Log to Fayetteville, Al and Terry had actually grown up on the south side of Atlanta. And so they came down to visit family, came over. We decided we wanted to go out to dinner together, and Debbie and I had found this wonderful steakhouse in Fayetteville, a place that we really loved. So we wanted to take our friends out to this place that we had found. And it wasn't until we were sitting down at the table that I remembered Terry's vegetarian. Or like the college friend that came to visit. We had been very close friends in college. This woman, we sang together a lot. If you closed your eyes, you could really imagine that you were listening to Emmylou Harris. She had that kind of voice. We loved singing together. We became great friends, almost like brother and sister in a lot of ways. And she came to visit us while we were living in Indiana. Now, I don't mean to brag, but until you have had pork tenderloin that comes off of my grill, you have not experienced pork tenderloin to its fullest. And I really outdid myself on this particular tenderloin to serve up to my vegan friend. Do you see where I slipped up? It's not really about the food. It's about the hospitality. I slipped up by not considering where the other person was, by not thinking about their story or their life experiences. And that's what Paul wants to point out in this section of the letter, talking to this church in Corinth, maybe talking to this church in Colorado Springs. One of the really cool things about my job is that my office is located at the Tennyson Center for Children in Denver. I get to see on an almost daily basis the wonderful work that staff does working with children who have been abused and neglected. I get to serve on the board of that organization and get to hear the work that goes on there. Recently, I was able to visit with the chaplain at the Tennyson Center. And we had a great conversation around, often there are some very well-meaning church folk that come to help out. And I mean that with all sincerity. These are deeply faithful, well-meaning people. And they believe that if we could just give these kids Jesus, that would take care of things for them. And you know that's right. But if you're talking to a 7 or an 8-year-old who might quite likely have been abused by religious people, then the road to Jesus is going to be very, very different. And if I can't take the time to pause and listen and understand that story or understand that life experience, I'm going to have a much harder time walking that road to Jesus with that child. I mean, how does this wildly diverse region that we have become one church? East, west, north, south, large, small, city, town. All these different churches. What do we do? We kind of try to paint them all the same shade of gray. Or do we take all of those vibrant, wonderful colors and learn to listen? Hear the stories that come out of Pocatello, Idaho, and Kanab, Utah, and Denver and Colorado Springs and Pueblo and Alamosa and all these wonderful places. And hear how we all are being faithful servants. Can we hear that story of the other? Maybe that way we can start to become all things. Maybe that's what Paul had in mind. You know, we had a General Assembly in Orlando, Florida, summer before last. And I was serving as the interim regional minister for the Oklahoma region at the time. And I knew one of the resolutions that was coming to that assembly was going to cause some heartburn. We had a resolution presented that was titled, Becoming a People of Grace and Welcome to All. And I knew that was going to create some heartburn for some of our congregations, and knew that in turn that would create some heartburn for me as well, because the resolution was explicit that when we were talking about all, that we were including gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender persons as well. I did not expect the pushback that we got on another resolution, an emergency resolution that was presented at the assembly. Now remember, we're in Florida in July of 2013. We were in Orlando, Florida at the time the jury in the case of the state of Florida versus George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin returned a not guilty verdict. They chose to acquit. We learned that the U.S. Justice Department had launched a civil rights investigation. And so there was an emergency resolution presented and passed that basically said two things. One, we want our general minister and president to work with her ecumenical partners and support that Justice Department investigation. And Sharon had spoken some very good pastoral words to us at the assembly, and we said we want that shared beyond the 4,000 people that are here. We want that message to go out to the wider church. I wasn't prepared for the pushback on that. But there were some who saw that resolution as the church taking a side. That the church was trying to dictate who was right and who was wrong. Now, there are facts in that case that we don't know and probably can never know. But the question really becomes, can we hear the story of another? Can we hear about the life experiences of another that cause them to hear that verdict differently from what I do? And can we respect that? See, no matter what my Aunt Lexi might have told me about my own ancestry, no matter where I went to elementary school, no matter what my life experiences are, mine are different from that other person. I can't have somebody else's life experience. I can't live that life. I can't become that person. But can I hear that story? Can I listen? Can I become a presence to that person? Can I become a partner to that person by opening my ears and opening my heart to that person? I can't become all things to all people, but the good news is I don't have to. Because even though I may have the freedom to speak to all, I also have the choice to listen to all. And when we open our minds, our hearts, our ears to that other person's story, I never cease to be amazed by the times that in that story of another, we hear the voice of God calling us to even deeper service.